Chapter 4, Books. The book chapter goes way back into history because we really are talking about the very earliest stages of nonverbal human communication. The beginnings of writing occurs about 5,500 years ago in Egypt or Mesopotamia. This earliest form of writing was pictographs, which I think you can understand what that means, and ideographs. Okay, those are symbols that stand for an idea. About 4,000 years ago, the beginnings of what we could kind of see as an alphabet begins to emerge. By about 3,500 years ago, very early forms of alphabets had been developed. I mean, think about for a moment what a breakthrough this is. Instead of having to have a symbol for each individual action, for each individual thing, now you could have a relatively small number of symbols that could be strung together and could be used to describe anything. You can't talk about the beginning of books without talking about the beginning of writing surfaces. And for the sake of this conversation, we're going to set caves or cave walls aside. That said, there has been a general evolution in writing surfaces from those that are labor-intensive to create, bulky, difficult to transport, to writing surfaces that are lighter, more renewable, more information dense, more transportable, but at the trade-off of being more fragile. The earliest known writing surface is cuneiform, wedge-shaped clay tablets, used as a writing surface in ancient Sumeria. The amazing thing about cuneiform is that there are still tablets that are readable today. Think about that. A message that is more than nearly 4,000 years old, that is still readable. Do you think we'll have emails from today around in 4,000 years? I doubt it. Papyrus was a real advancement. Polished plant reeds, light, stackable, transportable, renewable resource. But papyrus scrolls were terribly fragile. Much of the wisdom of antiquity was in the great library in Alexandria, Egypt, and that wisdom was on papyrus scrolls, and they were consumed by a terrible fire. The first known books in the European tradition were written on parchment, animal hide, animal skin, goat skin, sheepskin, horsehide. And parchment is a very attractive writing surface. It is very durable. The Getty Center has a wonderful collection of what are called illuminated manuscripts, and they are 500 and more years old, and the parchment is holding up just beautifully. But on the other hand, think about all the little goats or sheep that had to give up their hides just for one book, and all the labor that was involved in just creating the writing surface for one book. We are in a historic transition right now. We're in the transition between paper as the dominant writing surface, and paper will be around for a long, long time. But it is steadily being replaced by the electronic writing surface, which I'm calling Pixel here because I like alliteration. Just as an example, until not so many years ago, Glendale College sent out paper report cards. Today, to find out your grade at the end of the semester, you have to go off to my GCC. It is an electronic document. So get on the chat box. Tell me, what documents can you think of that have migrated from paper to the electronic writing surface? The first known European books were called illuminated manuscripts. They are works of art. The Getty Center has a marvelous collection of them, maybe one of the world's greatest collections. These books are between 500 and 1,000 years old, and they are still beautiful. In the PowerPoint version of this presentation, I have a link that you can follow about how these books were made. And I do recommend that you follow that link because it shows how the books were commissioned one at a time and how it took a team of artisans just to create one book. In recent, students sometimes ask me, where does mass media begin? Well, I'm not exactly sure, but if you could fire off a starter's pistol, bang, let's say we're off, on the race to create mass media. I think a good place to fire that starter's pistol would be 1455 with Johann Gutenberg, who did not invent the first printing press. There was clearly a Chinese device before Gutenberg's invention. What Gutenberg did do was he invented a system of movable type. What movable type did, and take a look at this woodcut illustration here. Gutenberg used a converted wine press, and he was able to assemble individual letters cast out of metal into lines of type, into pages of type. Gutenberg was known for his printed Bibles. I believe they own 3 of them at the Huntington Library in San Marino. And the important thing about this system of movable type was whenever Gutenberg made enough copies of the pages that he was printing, then he could break it back down into its individual letters and reassemble it into other pages. What this really is the beginning of the mass-produced written word. Note the difference between illuminated manuscripts and Gutenberg's system of movable type is that the illuminated manuscripts were created one at a time. Gutenberg could create economies of scale. Years. The consequences of Gutenberg's printing press. Before Gutenberg, most of the illuminated manuscripts were religious books, and religious books in a largely Roman Catholic Europe. So they were written in Latin, the language of the church. But that said, even back then, people didn't speak Latin on an everyday basis. When they were at the marketplace bartering for fish, they were speaking earlier versions of French or German or Italian or Spanish. And what Gutenberg's printing press did as it began to proliferate across Europe was it encouraged books on a variety of topics written more and more in the local language. So to some degree, Gutenberg's printing press helped to champion standardized written versions of French, Spanish, Italian, German, and so forth. Also, books out of the printing press were more standardized than illuminated manuscripts, which were created one at a time. It has been noted that Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation started in Germany. Gutenberg was in Germany. Martin Luther was not too long after Gutenberg. Is there a connection? Well, perhaps. Some suggest that as more and more books were published on more and more topics, people began to be exposed to a greater range of ideas about religious and other matters. The illustration at the bottom of this screen is of one of the illuminated manuscripts that is at the Huntington Library in San Marino. Please note that even though Gutenberg's text was printed, that artwork was done by hand. Let's move across to the United States and talk about literacy in the early United States. Benjamin Franklin was a fascinating fellow. He did a lot of things in his life, and one of them was to create the first lending libraries. Now, in his early version of the public library, you had to subscribe to it, but still, the basic concept was there. 1830s, 1840s. This would have been before California joined the United States. During this era in the US, serial novels, in other words, stories that carry over from book to book, were popular. Several decades later, during the Civil War era, an early form of pulp fiction, the dime novel, oftentimes Wild West tales or other tales of extreme bravery, with the violence oftentimes kind of amped up. In the Civil War era, paperback dime novels gained popularity. There is a very nice collection of them at the Autry Museum in Griffith Park. It should be noted that by the second part of the 19th century, that more and more publishers were publishing an ever-increasing amount of inexpensive books, magazines, and newspapers. And that led to a positive literacy spiral. As more and more reading material was available, more and more people were encouraged to read. As more and more people learned to read, the bigger the market for inexpensive reading materials. The book business today. The publishers are the ones who accept manuscripts from the content creators, the authors. The publishers are the ones who edit the book, they lay out the look of the book, they print the book, they promote the book, they advertise the book, they may send the author out on a book tour. They are the ones who get the books to bookstores, and they are the ones who send the royalties, that is, the profits, to the authors. The authors, of course, are the content creators. They are the ones who create the fiction or nonfiction stories. And the booksellers are the retailers. Now, I'd like you to light up that chat box. Which of these functions do you think are the most threatened by the disruptive power of the internet? Now, I know we've talked about what the internet and disruption means, but let me give it to you a little bit again. Think about how Uber and Lyft have disrupted the traditional taxi cab business. Think about how Netflix disrupted the traditional video store. So that's what I mean by the disruptive power of the internet. Book industry trends. You probably are not surprised to find that ebook sales are continuing to grow. The growth rate is less than it was because that market is becoming fairly mature. Print book sales are declining, but they're declining slowly. It does not look like print books will become extinct anytime soon, but they are a declining market. A worrisome stat about the book industry is how much power Amazon has come to have in the world of books. And not that I have anything against Amazon. It's just that for one company to account for a third of book sales, that is a lot of influence. As for the traditional bookstore chains, they are pretty much all gone except for Barnes & Noble. And Barnes & Noble made a couple of good moves. They got a textbook division. That's a pretty steady part of the book world. Also, more than the other traditional brick and mortar bookstore chains, they got into ebooks pretty early, going so far as to have their own digital book player for a number of years, the Nook. Now, the trend that I think is most surprising is that independent booksellers are doing pretty well. I think the way I interpret this is that the weaker independent bookstores have died. And the ones that remain, the stronger ones, the ones that know their market, that know their neighborhood better, they're doing all right. Let's get to some terminology in the book business. And I'm going to do these terms in 3 pairs. Pair number 1. Editions and printings. Not every book needs a new edition. If we're talking about Plato's Republic, written 2,200 years ago, I don't think that Plato is going to arise from the dead and rewrite it. So a new edition is when a book needs to be revised and updated. For example, your textbook for Mass Comm 101 goes into a new edition, I would say on average, once every 2 years. And the reason for that is there are a lot of new developments going on in the world of mass communication. The book would get terribly out of date if it didn't go into new editions fairly frequently. Books go into new printings. Well, only paper books go into new printings. Let's put it that way. Ebooks, you just keep making copy after copy after copy. But with a print book, the presses do press runs. You sell a novel to a mainstream publisher. They have modest hopes for it. They print up 10,000 copies. Then luck shines down on you. You are a guest on Ellen DeGeneres' talk show. She gives, you get a very nice interview with her, and all of a sudden bookstores are ordering your novel from the publisher, and they have to do a press run of 50,000. That would be a second printing. For things that have become kind of classics that never seem to go out of style, Jack Kerouac's On the Road. I have no idea how many printings a book like that has gone through. Our next pair of terms are advances and royalties. An advance, this is payments to the author, I should say. An advance is money up front. If you are a big name author, if you are someone who the publishers are just climbing all over each other to get hold of, you could get an enormous advance. Of course, most beginning authors don't get an advance at all. And you may wonder, the term is an advance against what? Well, and advance against royalties. Now, nearly every author gets royalties. They are a percentage of book sales. And in the traditional book world, the percentage of book sales that the author gets is kind of disappointing. Hardcover book, 10%, 12%. Paperback, a little less than that, 8% perhaps. Now, if you are a J.K. Rowling or a Stephen King, if you are a big name author, your agent will negotiate a royalty, much higher than that. But for the average author, yeah, about the percentages that I quoted. The last pair of terms are, what do you do if a publisher doesn't want your book? Or what do you do if you don't like the terms under which a publisher might want your book? Well, you have two options. One is self-publishing. And in the paper world, self-publishing is quite an investment of time and money. It means that you should hire an editor, because oftentimes you can't see your own mistakes. You hire a graphic artist to lay out the look of your book. You hire a printer and a bookbinder, and then you eventually have cartons and cartons and cartons of books, and then you become the marketing staff that tries to figure out, how do I either sell those books directly or get them into bookstores? Self-publishing in the online world is a lot simpler. For example, Amazon's Kindle platform makes digital self-publishing quite easy. The vanity press is also called subsidy publishing. And that is a type of publishing house that will print pretty much anything. What's the catch? Well, the catch is that you pay them for the privilege. They don't pay you. Most vanity press books are considered to be kind of unpublishable by typical. It takes a long time to get a book published. If it's an ebook, the process can be a little shorter. But please take a good look at this graphic, which is in the chapter in your textbook. The claim here is that it takes the better part of 2 years from idea to bookshelf. Now that said, there are some topics, maybe books about very timely type matters. Let's say a book about the beginnings of the coronavirus crisis. Something like that you would want to get on the shelves a lot more quickly. Means. Let's talk about the textbook business. I know that a significant number of my students rent their textbooks, and I must say that's a reasonable option. Now that said, the statistics are that that has plateaued. It is a market that is, at least for now, gotten about as big as it's going to get. The Government Accounting Office, that's what GAO is there. The Government Accounting Office says the average student spends about $1,250 a year on textbooks and school supplies. That said, if you're going to law school or something like that, you're probably spending quite a bit more than $1,250 a year. As I mentioned in an earlier slide, I think one of the good moves that Barnes & Noble made was to have a textbook division. If nothing else, the textbook business is probably one of the most steady parts of the book business. I don't know when Glendale College will have mostly ebooks and very few paper textbooks. I get the feeling that the coronavirus crisis and the move to remote learning is probably accelerating the transition toward ebook ebooks and ebook readers. What I would like to know from you, what would be a nice contribution to the chat box, is tell me, which do you prefer? Do you generally prefer e-textbooks or paper textbooks? And why do you prefer what you prefer? I would also like to know, because I really don't know among my students, are you using the ebook version of Ralph Hanson's textbook, or are you using the paper version? Books and censorship. In the United States, we do not have a federal banned books list. However, there is a form of book banning that sometimes happens at the local level. It can be when a book becomes controversial and the school board bumps it from the reading list, or the book gets taken out of the public library. But that said, we generally don't have the stereotypical people throwing books into a bonfire sort of thing, although it's probably happened. Globally, being an author, depending on the topic of your book, being an author can be a dangerous occupation. I think of an author like Salman Rushdie, author of the Satanic Verses, and how he has had very credible death threats against him. Now, the link at the top of this slide is to a list of banned books, a web page at the University of Pennsylvania. And so what they do at that page at the University of Pennsylvania is they take every book, past or present, and in this case it's mostly past, that was banned somewhere for some reason. And so they give you a link to Catcher in the Rye, or they give you a link to the L. Frank Baum Oz books of 100 years ago. And you may wonder, why would any local jurisdiction ban, the Wonderful Wizard of Oz or something like that? Because it had witchcraft in it. And I think most of us would say, oh, come on, that's silly. But I'm going to ask you the harder question, and I'd like you to light up the chat box with this. Is there ever a book that has ideas that are so dangerous that the ideas could perhaps move some people to violence? Is a book ever so dangerous that maybe it deserves to be banned? I guess what I'm thinking of is Germany after, 70 years. They just recently and very cautiously reintroduced Mein Kampf, Hitler's manifesto of Aryan supremacy. They just very cautiously and very recently reintroduced Mein Kampf in the German language. And even at that, it is apparently heavily annotated by German historians and others. Well, we have our haters too in the United States. Is there any book that is so dangerous that maybe we ought to say about censorship, well, maybe just this one time? Books and the long tail. In the 1990s, Jeff Bezos wanted to come up with a store that would work out of a warehouse sort of system. And it would sell the entire variety of something. And so he thought about, well, what if I sent people a paper catalog that would have every book in the world that was published? And he realized that would be completely impractical. It would mean a book catalog the size of a phone book, if not bigger. I mean, if the printing wouldn't put you out of business, the postage would. Eventually, He hit on the bare bones of the Amazon model. What Amazon warehouses would do is they would carry the most popular books, and then if something was more obscure, Amazon had a way of getting it to you. It would just take a little longer. Now, when books became digital, that's when the Amazon model really began to pay off. With digital books, it became possible to have nearly every book available for download. Now, think about how with paper books, there are books that are called out of print. It's like, yeah, we did a press run of this book, 20 years ago, and we sold our 5,000 of them or whatever. And now maybe 10 more people per year would want this book, but we're not going to do another press run just for 10 people per year. Well, with a digital book, you can just keep that book in some massive server farm somewhere. And if only 10 people a year want it, sure, sell it to them. Furthermore, digital self-publishing allows anybody to be an author. An example that I give students is if you go off to a fine university, we'll say Berkeley, and you're an English major, you may take the senior thesis option, and maybe it's a novella you've written. Hey, why not publish it on the Amazon Kindle platform? I also think that digital platforms have helped secure a future for the so-called great books, the poems of Edgar Allan Poe or the great Greek philosophers, so forth. The so-called great books never have huge demand, but they always have a little bit of demand. Well, digital distribution of books will help those texts live essentially forever. Chris Anderson first conceptualized the long tail. He was the editor of Wired magazine, and originally the long tail was articles in Wired, and eventually he published it as a book. And so he really did see how the long tail was going to make us not so much about physical communities as about communities of interest. And with the long tail, maybe no interest is too obscure. We've been talking about books in general. Maybe I should talk a little bit about ebooks. When do they begin? I think I start the modern ebook era in 1971 with Michael Hart. He was a doctoral student in English at the University of Illinois. In those days, before people had personal computers, they, meaning graduate students, would get precious time on the university's mainframe computer. Michael Hart used his time on the university's mainframe computer to type in the text of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Mr. Hart felt that he had created $1 million worth of value. Why? Because he thought way back there in 1971 that eventually the average person would have some sort of digital device that would allow them to read that digital text of the Declaration of Independence. So then he asked himself, out of all the people in the U.S., about how many people would want their own personal copy, digital copy of the Declaration of Independence? He thought, well, 1 million people maybe. How much would they pay for it? Maybe $1. And so after he got his PhD, Dr. Hart became an English professor at another university in Illinois. And he, his graduate students, and community volunteers started the Gutenberg Project. And eventually, they took more than 6,500 great works of literature and put them into digital form where to this day they are available for free download. 40 years after Michael Hart typed the Declaration of Independence into the mainframe computer at the University of Illinois, 40 years after that, summer 2011, Amazon reported that for the first time, they sold more ebooks than paper books. I don't think the trend has reversed itself. You know, when we talk about books that are not on paper, don't forget about audiobooks. Certainly, audiobooks are used by visually impaired people. Audiobooks are enjoyed by people who are in their automobiles for long periods of time. Audiobooks may even help students study their class material while they're running in the park. Small batch publishing is interesting. The Glendale College Speech Department uses small batch publishing. They have created their own version of the Speech 101 textbook. It is unique to Glendale College, and it's profitable for the publisher to accommodate our speech department because of print on demand, small batch publishing. Paper books and ebooks coexist in today's world, but will that continue? You know, a problem that ebooks have is there's a format battle going on. So just as in the early years of recorded music, Edison wanted music to be recorded on tin cylinders, and a gentleman named Emil Berliner thought that flat discs were better. It took a certain period of years before the flat discs won out. And in the 1980s, there was a format battle between the Sony-backed Beta system for videotaping, and then there was the VHS system. VHS eventually won out. Well, I think the future of ebooks will be more assured once we get one dominant ebook format. You know, this format battle is one of the reasons why the author Jonathan Franzen says, look, you know, a disadvantage to ebooks is you don't know how long it'll be readable. I mean, think about the ebook that you download today. Will you have a device that'll be able to read it in 20 years? Will you have a device that'll be able to read it in 10 years? The answer is, we don't know. Students vary in their preference for digital textbooks versus paper textbooks. The students who like paper textbooks say, well, they're easier to write in. The students who prefer digital textbooks say, yeah, but you can have all the books that are assigned to you this semester on you at all time, on your phone. Another advantage of ebooks, and this is especially if you're an Amazon customer, is ebooks give you instant gratification. You know, you browse Amazon's digital offerings. You can download a chapter as a free sample oftentimes. And then if you want the book, you can buy it and it gets delivered to your phone in literally a minute. So, all right, to end this chapter, hit the chat box. What do you predict is the future of books and why? This ends chapter 4.